Snow White is a damsel in distress story, and damsel in distress stories reflect something that's true, which is that women love being saved, and we want a man to use any effort possible to come and save us, and men like doing that in turn. There is that truth about damsel in distress stories. And so when our society looks at that and says, no, actually, women are stronger than that and they can save themselves, let's make a different story. You just get such a lifeless lump of cinema. And why is that? It's because it's just not true.
Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am back with my lovely daughter, Sydney Parshell. How's it going, Sid?
Great.
So we kind of were ships passing the night. I was helping Kyra with the debate tournament, and you drove in and just finished a whole 12 hours of judging? Do you feel all judged out?
Yeah.
How was that experience for you?
It was honestly really fun because it kind of reminded me of my favorite parts of debate, which is like just the stimulation that it gave me. I felt like I wasn't that super naturally gifted at debating, but it just felt like I was just like thinking so hard and like constantly stimulated during a debate round. And so as a judge, I kind of felt the same way, like paying attention and like taking all the notes and deliberating and stuff. So yeah, it was really fun.
So good. Yeah, I love it too. So I got to judge on Wednesday. Sydney did it Thursday. April's there today, finishing up the tournament. And then, yeah. So someday we'll do a podcast on why every one of your children should consider and likely do speech and debate. But that's not for today. But we are going to talk, speaking of judging and attention, those are the two topics we're going to hit kind of today. So I want to talk to you about the problem of evil. So this is the problem of evil, something called a theodicy, which is a defense for God when somebody is presenting the problem of evil. So there's a way that was framed in a book and in an interview that a guy named Ross Douthat, he is a New York Times columnist. He just wrote a book called Believe that I'm in the middle of right now. I'm very much enjoying. But he said some things about the problem of evil, a couple of comments in this clip that I'm really, that really struck me as like, wow, that's so helpful. So I want to talk about that. And then I also want to talk about how story, I think, is one of the greatest ways to understand the truth of God. So we're gonna dive into like, okay, why believe in God? And a lot of you guys, I'm sure, who are listening to this believe in God, but it's really important because we don't only need to believe in God, we also need to trust God. And so we have to talk about the problem of evil, both with non-believers who are struggling with it, and it's causing them to sort of stumble in their belief that God exists. But every believer I've ever met is going to run into major seasons of their life where they're going to struggle with the idea of the goodness of God, and it's going to come out as a wrestle with this problem of evil. So I want to play this clip for you, and we can discuss how Ross Douthat deals with this problem.
One of them, of course, you would deal with is the classic, the problem of evil. If God is all powerful and all good, how come evil exists in the world? How come bad things exist in the world? And this actually seems to be a hard problem in that, the Bible addresses it multiple times directly, such as in the book of Job, or you can think of Luke 13, where they asked Jesus about the Galileans who were slain and their lesbics on the altar. But the Bible never gives us an answer. We don't get an answer. So what do you say? What's your response to the problem of evil?
I mean, I think the Bible offers multiple invitations to wrestle with the problem. And I think if the God of the Bible is real, his desire is for us to be concerned with the problem, it's, you can go all the way back to Abraham arguing with God about whether to spare Sodom, right? And go all the way through the book of Job, where the people who are trying to justify God's ways end up condemned. Even though God plays his trump card on Job, he doesn't say your friends were right. He says you were right, but you're still wrong, right? And then you enter the New Testament where, to me personally, I find the, passion narratives, crucifixion and so on to be a very sort of intuitively appealing response to the problem of evil, where it's like, okay, you have this problem and God himself has entered into creation and experienced the worst. Anything you experience, God has in some mysterious way experienced as well. But that's not at all a logical proof, right?
No.
And I think in its own way, it intensifies the problem for some people, because from their view, it's like, okay, you've got God himself. He's here when he's on earth. He's always healing people. He loves children. He cares about everybody. Like, why does in the everyday he, not heal everybody? Right.
Mhm.
Okay. So up till now, he's kind of articulated what I've always heard before. And these are good. These are good. Like the Bible invites us to wrestle with the problem of evil. And the Bible doesn't actually directly answer the problem. And it gives us, really these two grand narratives that I think are the center of the kind of wrestling with the problem: Job in the Old Testament and the passion narrative of Jesus' crucifixion in the New Testament. These are the two places to go. All right, so that's his setup. But his final statement there, that this in some ways intensifies the problem, because now you are coming into contact with a compassionate, good God. Like, you see that God loves people and is a good God in the Old Testament, but then you encounter Jesus, and that does nothing but intensify our understanding of God's compassion. And so how do we deal with that? So where he goes next is really interesting to me.
Like, if Jesus is the revelation of God, shouldn't God, heal every child who ever gets cancer and so on, that kind of thing. So it's a hard problem for a reason. I think it's a really bad reason not to be religious and not to believe in God, right? Because to go from this problem complicates and challenges my relationship with God to this problem invalidates the arguments for God's existence is this incredibly presumptuous move, right? That essentially arrogates to oneself a kind of, divine, a sort of divine God level perspective on the entirety of creation, where you're like, well, I can stand outside of all creation and weigh things up in the balance, and I can see that if God was good, he's making some big mistakes here, right?
That was Job. He wanted to put God on trial.
Right. Where would you possibly get that perspective if you are not already, an ensouled creation participating in the divine nature to some degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think you have to have a tacitly religious perspective on what human beings are, even to get to the point where you could possibly aspire to pass judgment on Almighty God, right? And like the claim of the materialist that, the human being is this jumped up ape enslaved to his, biological operations, but also he has figured out that the moral order of the universe is deeply awry and God has failed.
Right.
Something. I don't think that makes sense. I think it makes more sense to maintain it the way God seems to intend, as a problem to wrestle with, than to use it as a trump card. I think there is I say this in the book, but there is a kind of, an aridity, a sort of dry, coolness to a certain kind of attempt to do theodicy by this calculus, right? Where you say, look, you have to have free will. You have to have the possibility of evil in order for human beings to be independent and not just automatons. I think that's right, but it does seem to sort of fall short a little bit at the doors of Auschwitz, right? Like, it's like, okay, but this much evil, do you have to have that?
Right.
But I think the flip side is also true, that there is this weird sense in which the argument about how God would have to be bad to have made the world seems to become more and more popular among people as they experience less suffering. Not always. There are people who experience suffering and lose faith in God. Absolutely, that happens. But if you look at sort of the macro level of like American society right now, the person who tells you that, God doesn't exist because of the problem of evil is much more likely to be an affluent successful,
Right.
well-educated person experiencing the most comfortable life of any human group in all of recorded history, right? Whereas when you go out into realms of suffering, not whether back into the past, where obviously like even a toothache with this, nightmare of epic proportions, or just into realms like, realms of chronic illness, realms of sort of persistent addiction and suffering in our own society, you find a lot more people for whom the problem of evil isn't really it's not what they're worrying about. Right?
Right.
They're trying to lean on God to get them through suffering. And I think you do have to weigh that reality. Again, proof of anything, but in the balance of figuring out, is this a good reason not to believe? Is this a good reason not to practice? And if the people who are suffering the most don't seem to regard it as one, then maybe you, the comfortable reader, should not regard it as such either.
Boom. All right. So, yeah, there's a lot there to unpack, but I want to get Sydney your reaction. There's really two different points he's making there that I think both are really, really deep, and something that, I think is really worth grappling with. So he talks about how when you look at um, the story of and sort of the theodicy that people have about the nature of evil, for them to cast judgment on God, they have to themselves sort of posit their nature as somehow being able to judge the moral, the morality of the universe and God Himself. I have no problem putting God on trial, and I know that I personally have all the evidence, all the intelligence, and all the moral wisdom to be able to judge Him. This argument from the same people who think we are enslaved to our instincts as overgrown apes, apes with larger brains. These you got to pick one. You can't have both. You can't have it both of those ways, right? So I think that's a really, really that's a great framing that I think, where exactly are you standing morally to make this judgment on God? So that's his first argument. Yeah. Any thoughts on that one?
Um, yeah, well, I feel like that's why part of the biggest response that God had to Job in the Bible was, "Who are you
Yeah.
to say these things? Who are you? Who do you think you are?" Like, I feel like that's such a good response. And honestly, I say that to myself sometimes when I go into those modes of like, "Why would you let this happen?" Like, there are so many better ways to do it. Like, well, who are you? Who are you to say that? I think I laugh because it's just so appropriate. I don't know. And that is interesting that those questions, the questioning of God, is coming from the same people who don't think humans are anything more than just a coincidence of evolution. So yeah, that is interesting to think about. Um, but I feel like the wrestling component is so important here because it's not easy to just tell people, here's why there's evil in the world, like, or here's why it exists. It's because of free will. It's because of all the like it's kind of just hard to educate someone on that without them wrestling about it within themselves. Um, I feel like it's the same reason why you can't just tell someone that you love them without showing them anything. It's like, well, how am I supposed to know that? Um, how do you know that God loves you if you haven't ever like experienced anything? You're not going to believe anyone if they say that God loves you. Like I haven't seen that. You have to kind of get that revelation for yourself in order to fully believe it. So I think it's kind of the same thing where it's like you kind of have to wrestle with this with yourself um, in order to fully come to terms with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think he's doing a great job of speaking the right words. Even if you do have to wrestle with it yourself, it is still good to hear those things and just remember you're a human. You have nowhere near the scope of perspective that God does. So who are we to judge what is evil and what God did wrong?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the story of Job is important, but also the structure of Job. God waited for 35 chapters of conversation before showing up in
Mm.
that book to Job. And I read and study, this book, really, really deeply, 3 times, every 3 years, right, in our Bible reading plan. So we're in Job right now. And this was the thing I really wanted to meditate on during this time, because I'm reading, again, 35 chapters of beautiful Hebrew poetry about, this argument going back and forth between Job and his two and eventually, three friends, and or three and four friends. It's crazy um, how the structure really is really speaking to me about what Ross Douthat is saying about God wants us to wrestle with this. He wants Job, like, and poor Job is sitting there just covered in boils, and has these thankless friends who are telling him it's all his fault, and he's constantly kind of exerting his innocence. This cannot be the main reason why I'm suffering. At the same time, he's just like, this, it's got to be somehow God's ignorance. This wrestle, like, but God wants them to spend 35 chapters, um, and composing these different arguments, and just and really fully, like, getting down further and deeper into this discussion. And then he shows up, and yeah, to your point, his answer is, who are you, so where were you when I made the world? You don't have the wisdom, you don't understand what you're talking about. And so the understanding of the problem of evil, the only way to overcome it is through humility. I think that's kind of what he's saying. Humility is the key.
Have you ever considered starting a family business so you can spend more time working as a family team? We've started a year-long coaching program called Family Inc., where you get weekly coaching with Jeremy, access to our video training for launching family businesses, and lots of ideas for businesses to start that are working for other family teams. Head over to familyteams.com and click Family Inc. to learn more, or to set up a strategy call with Jeremy to see if this might be a good fit for you.
If you are a proud person, if you're and what the essence of that pride is going to do is it's going to cause you to think that you have the ability to judge God and to judge him correctly. It's really that pride that gives strength to the problem of evil in your heart. The second argument he's making here is he's saying that the most comfortable people in the world are the ones who are most likely to stand behind this argument. And the people who are actually suffering are the ones who are most likely to lean on God and go to God in their suffering, and to find comfort in pursuing God and in believing in God. Why is that? So he's kind of like, it's really an interesting problem. This poor person who's like $6 cup of coffee has burned them, and now he believes that God is maybe responsible for this, and outraged at the immorality of the universe, is able to cast judgment on God, where the person who is, really suffering with starvation, with illness, oftentimes is the person who is going to God, and in receiving, like, immense comfort from their faith. So yeah, any thoughts about that argument? Because I think that's really an interesting observation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's something so unique about firsthand experiencing suffering that just draws you to God. And it's just a very unique experience that is negative, but somehow is so effective in drawing people to God. And I can say this as someone with somewhat of a chronic issue. I feel like it would be so easy to look at people like that. Say, I'm talking about my scoliosis, but it would be so easy for a scoliosis person to look at that problem and be like, "That is horrible. I can't believe you're going through that. That's terrible. Like, what God would do that to you?" Versus someone who actually is going through the problem and is dealing with it, and what that does to your spirit and how reliant that makes you on the Lord. And we all know that the more reliant you are on the Lord, the better your relationship will be. The better your relationship is, the better your life is, or just your outlook on life. So I think it's just so easy when you're not experiencing suffering to just assume what it's like to go through it, and just to see it as an outsider. Something about it seems so unjustified and horrible, versus people who are actually going through it feel that gravity to God. And I think that's the reason.
Very good. Yeah, that makes so much sense. So yeah, this is all by way of, again, saying, man, we need to make sure that we are prepared for dealing with suffering. And so many Christians the way their faith is constructed, they're really one struggle with suffering away from losing their faith. And I think one of the things I really learned from this, this clip was, man, we need to really stay in a very humble posture. And there's so much in our culture that's all about making us the center of the story. And we're absolutely outraged when something, offends or affects us personally. That it's really that pride that I think is going to give, a lot of power to the doubts that you might experience. And it's going to rob from you the ability to enter into a deep, meaningful connection with God through your suffering. And so, yeah, that I found this a very helpful framing in the way that he described, how to really think through or deal with the problem of suffering and evil. All right. So, second thing I want to talk to you about is, so I go through different seasons where different arguments about God have really bolstered my faith. And I would say that the last, 5 years plus, one of the arguments that has surprised me that it's so deeply like has strengthened my faith is the sort of story, the way that the world seems to have a story frame to it, and that meaning itself is really discerned through a story. Why is that? That doesn't seem at all. That would not make any sense to me of why of a world that was sort of created by accident or anything like that. There's something. Either the world is meaningless or filled with meaning. And if the world is filled with meaning, then it makes sense why we're so obsessed with stories. If the world is meaningless, then we should not care that much about stories. We should see the world as random, essentially, that everything is sort of like happenstance. And so meaning can't really exist within a world like that. But nobody lives that way that I know. Everyone tends to care a ton about story and how the story of their life is being framed. And if somebody says something about them, they feel morally outraged, and their whole lens through which they see the world is through story, and they spend most of their leisure time like listening to stories, watching stories, obsessing on stories. And all of that makes complete sense. If God created a world that is filled with meaning, then story would be that way. So I watched this video, which I thought was really interesting. This somebody was just kind of drilled down the layers of how that works. And I was like, man, I really want to get Sydney's take on this. So I'm gonna play this for you.
The story brings the value into view.
There they are.
And when we tell a story, we're curating the attention of others. We're controlling what they see and hear. We're saying, look at this. Listen to these words or this music. This information is the most important thing in the world right now. Pay attention to it.
Attention is a finite resource and it's costly, so you have to prioritize it. And there's no difference between prioritizing your attention and imposing a value structure. Those are the same thing. And then I think that the mechanisms that we use to prioritize our attention are stories.
Jordan Peterson is a divisive figure, but what he's saying here is undeniably true. The story is a meaning organizer. And so it's not surprising when there's a crisis of meaning in a culture, when there's a battle over what's really important, that we use stories to both remind ourselves what matters and stories to persuade others of what matters too. Some people argue that we use facts and logic to win arguments. But stories show us how those facts are meaningful. They're bound by value. And story is a value-revealing machine. If you want a child to know the truth, tell him the truth. If you want a child to love the truth, tell him a story. So storytelling is about the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
It's how we organize and express value, and it's how we try to convince others too. So it's inherently philosophical, inherently religious, inherently political. But that's not to say that stories are just political speeches in disguise. Stories have one way of communicating, and propositional truth has another. It's the difference between the mythos and the logos. In classical rhetoric, the art of persuasion can be divided into logos, the rational soundness of the argument itself, ethos, the credibility of the person making the argument, and pathos, the appeal to emotion or feeling. Story, or mythos, can be considered part of the pathos. Stories make us feel things and tap into our emotions. If you want a child to love the truth, tell him a story. But there's a soundness to stories, and a credibility too. Stories are remarkably powerful. And this power, the power of story, can be used for good or for ill.
I'm not going to take this anymore.
Just get up from your chairs right now. Go to
Where
the
you
window.
going? I wanna see if
Everybody
anybody's
just go to
yelling.
the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell and keep yelling. I'm mad as hell! I'm not gonna take this anymore!
I'm not gonna take it anymore! I'm mad as hell and I'm not gonna take it anymore!
I'm mad as hell! I'm not gonna take it anymore!
I'm mad as hell and
I'm not gonna take it anymore!
I'm mad as hell!
The current meaning crisis in the West is largely a result of the shift away from a coherent, overarching story. The West is now considered to be post-Christian. Society has moved on from the Christian myth stage and is entering a new era, a new stage in which, well, we'll see.
All right. So very interesting. And I think, his linking of story and pathos, this idea that what's so weird about story, and this is, you can't really almost, I don't know how you can't really overstate this because it's such a strange thing. People can watch a story and they just feel what's true. Like their emotions do something and they're drawn to something and they're so inherently, they're interesting, they're meaningful, they're powerful, they're transformative. But it's all happening at some level that's like, often subconscious, but also very collective. Like we all are having very similar and experiences this story. It's like, okay, that completely makes sense. Like one of the things that Richard Dawkins is very famous for saying in his, I think it's his book, The God Delusion, is that we live in exactly the kind of world you would expect if there was no God. And I think it's one of the most absurd things I've ever heard in my life. Like this to me is exhibit A of something I would not expect if there was no God, but I would totally expect if there was a God. I would expect the world to have a story obsession, a meaning obsession, and that this would be the framework through which everything would be looked at. That makes complete sense to me, especially given the fact that God is telling a story. God gave us a story. We are constantly meaning seeking creatures. I have no idea why we're obsessed with that if we're just overgrown apes looking for food and trying to reproduce. Like that does not make any sense to me at all. But here we are. So I'm curious. Yeah, Sid, what did that clip stir up for you?
Yeah, I think it's so hard to articulate how much story means to me in particular because I'm the only one that can speak about my own experiences, but I know that it just speaks to people on so many different levels. Like there are concrete things I can list of why stories are important. Like, oh, they become really important metaphors for things about encounter in real life and whatever. But I think so much of it is just unexplainable because of that mysterious thing that happens inside of you that you were talking about. Like we just feel the truth somehow. We are somehow wired to for our emotions to just flare up and just feel something very passionate when we encounter something that feels true. And I think that's so mysterious. And I think that's something that 100%, like you're saying, would only be there if there was a creator that felt the same way. Like our creator clearly loves story. And so I think he embedded that in us so that it's such a integral part of who we are as humans as compared to the animals and why we are so drawn to it and why we are so creative and we're able to be co-creators of stories with God because a lot of our stories, most of them, if they're godly, will have some nuggets of truth in them from God. Um, and so there's something so unique about that being a creator of those stories. And I kind of think of it, like I said, as being like a co-creator with God. Like that is so unique. That is so precious. And I can't tell you how many times I've just like inexplicably felt so much emotion while I'm reading or watching something. And it's like, why am I feeling why do I want to cry right now? Like nothing emotional is happening. I remember this happened when I read the end of Mistborn, that book I told you about. The end of the series. There's something so beautiful about it that nothing sad was happening, but I was crying because it was just such a good story. And so it's really good to go back and like dissect in particular like which story you're reading, like why exactly you were crying, like why exactly it was so good. But I think just story in general does that to us. And like that is so unique. But yeah, it's so hard to put my finger on, but
Yeah.
there it's so special.
Yeah. Yeah. He made this point, and we've talked about this a little bit. What happens to story when you enter a post-Christian world? And I've wondered about that a lot. I'm not sure how to think about what happens to story, like what actually then allows you to say something meaningful about reality that an audience is going to resonate with when you no longer have a meta narrative that is shaping the culture, shaping the way that people perceive truth. And this is kind of what's bizarre about the nature of reality, and that is the first thing you encounter is a story that creates sort of the framework for meaning. That's what happens in the Bible. This is why we always start the story form life with Genesis 1. And this is why I'm so fascinated by the fact that the Bible begins in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It starts like it's a story. In the beginning, let me start, once upon a time. Like it gives you this story framework. And it doesn't start by making a bunch of statements about truth, like God exists, sin is evil. It's not like that. It doesn't sort of start with teaching. It just sort of tells you a story about how the earth was created and then what
Yeah.
happens to humanity. So yeah, any thoughts about what do you think might happen to story in a post-Christian context? Have you encountered anything in your reading of stories that kind of has given you kind of inklings about what that is, or do you think that's even possible?
Well, I think what he was saying in that video was so good, where if our society becomes confused about what truth is, then that will reflect in our stories and how confused they seem. Like,
Yeah.
um, I don't know about a book. A book doesn't come to mind, but the Snow White movie that just came out. I just watched a video breaking it down. I didn't watch it myself because I have no desire to. But he was talking about how terrible it was, and I feel like that the evolution of that story, how it started out in 1937 is one thing, and then they just made a new version in our new post-Christian world or whatever of the same story supposedly. Um, and I feel like it's just so bad. Anyone who sees it will feel that. Like it's so robbed of any kind of gratification or there's no payoff for anything. It doesn't make sense. Like there's so many things that's like, why doesn't it make sense? There's something about this that just does not resonate. And I think part of it is because Snow White is honestly, at some degree, a damsel in distress story originally. And damsel in distress stories reflect something that's true, which is that women love being saved and we want a man to use any effort possible to come and save us. And men like doing that in turn. So there is that truth about damsel in distress stories, for example. And so when our present society looks at that and says, no, actually, women are stronger than that and they can save themselves, let's make a different story. Let's take an old damsel in distress story and completely change it so that the woman is the one doing the saving. The prince is hardly a part of the story. You just get such a lifeless lump of cinema that can hardly even be called cinema. And like why is that? It's because it's just not true. It does not reflect truth. It doesn't feel like truth. It doesn't invigorate anyone. Like when I watch Snow White and Sleeping Beauty is another one that I love. That's a damsel in distress story. When I watch those, I just feel so much. Like it's so exciting and like, I love to watch the princess get saved and the prince fight for her. Like that is so there's something so invigorating about that. Um so when that is completely ripped down,
Mm.
when you try to replace it with something that people wish was true or just they want it to be true, they want to convince you it's true. It's not convincing. It doesn't speak to me.
Mm.
It's my soul isn't attracted to that.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's just so everyone is confused and everyone wants to push a new narrative that doesn't reflect what we believe is true or like
Yeah.
what our souls believe is true. They
Right.
just want to construct one of their own creation.
Yeah.
Are you following us on Facebook and Instagram yet? Look up at Family Teams to get even more free content and never miss out on event announcements.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, what he makes the point that stories are inherently philosophical, they're inherently political, they're inherently theological, and because they are reflecting truths, when you're constructing a story, one of the things you can do is test whether or not you are under the spell of a deception or a lie by whether or not a story based on those ideas holds together. And
Mm.
oftentimes these stories, they don't hold together. And then all of a sudden somebody comes out with a story that just everyone just feels in their gut is just a good story. It's beautiful. That's why I think it's
Yeah.
so oftentimes it's, the beautiful that causes us to have the most sort of instinctual awareness of what's true and where the truth lies. So, and
Yeah.
then, his statement, one of the points he's making there, if you want children to know the truth, tell them the truth. If you want children to love the truth, tell them a story. I'm curious what you would say. A lot of parents listen to this, and I think that oftentimes Christians can be confused about the importance of story in the process of parenting. So, as you've kind of grown up with this value, and also look forward to someday getting to pass this on to your children and the younger members of our family, any thoughts that you would give to a parent who maybe is like, why is this a big deal, and how can I possibly introduce my children to stories so that they can love the truth?
I think it's so beneficial. I loved, when I was younger, being read stories by my parents and my older siblings. That was very fun. We would often listen to audiobooks together. So maybe investing in audiobooks for your kids or reading to them yourself before bedtime, things like that. And I would say kind of maybe be a little more open-minded. I think there are some stories that are stigmatized for some reason, and maybe shouldn't be. I'm mainly thinking about Harry Potter. Do whatever you want with your own household, but I think that, when you're thinking about story, you should think a little more abstractly.
Yeah.
Like maybe people are very put off by the fact that there's magic in that book. But when I read that series, it just resonated with me on such a deep level. And I think that it would be very beneficial for kids to read that. Do whatever research you want on your own if you want to make decisions about your own household. Like, don't let me, tell you what to do. But, I think there are stories like that that, don't deserve the stigma that they do have. Think more abstractly in, like, what truths you are injecting into your children at an age. So I think that that is very important. Like, you don't remember, um, when you're reading a book as a kid, the main things that are important are the themes and, the truths that are within the story. Um, yeah. So I have examples, but, um, that's those are my 2 cents.
Yeah. I think there is sort of like a sometimes I think we can have a hyper literalism,
Yeah.
as Christians that cause us to not actually understand that symbols in stories actually speak to kids and speak to our own souls in ways that are different. And I think that, I oftentimes when I'm like watching Star Wars or reading Harry Potter, there are so many reflections of the gospel that are so clear.
Yeah.
I mean, Harry Potter is so clearly a Christ figure who, and so there's the constant like call to give up your life, to risk your life, to save others, and that level of sacrifice. I think that J.K. Rowling, regardless of her personal theology, she seems to really buy into the Christian story as being the sort of the overarching ideas about what is good. Now, sometimes they can glorify evil or evil magic, or like, there are things you're looking at and you're like, okay, let's understand if there's something getting in here. One of the things that there's a quote by C.S. Lewis. I'm curious if this stirs up anything for you. So he once wrote, this is on 3 ways of writing for children. He says, those who say that children must not be frightened may mean 2 things. They may mean one, that we must not do anything likely to give the child those haunting, disabling, pathological fears against which ordinary courage is helpless, in fact, phobias. His mind must, if possible, be kept clear of things he can't bear to think of. Or they may mean, too, that we must try to keep out of his mind the knowledge that he is born into a world of death, violence, wounds, adventure, heroism, and cowardice, good and evil. If they mean the first, I agree with them, but not if they mean the second. The second would indeed be to give children a false impression and feed them on escapism in the bad sense. There is something ludicrous in the idea of so educating a generation which is born to the Ogpu and the atomic bomb, since it is so likely that they will meet cruel enemies. Let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you are making their destiny not brighter, but darker. nor do most of us find that violence and bloodshed in a story produce any haunting dread in the minds of children. As far as that goes, I side impenitently with the human race against the modern reformer. Let there be wicked kings and beheadings, battles and dungeons, giants and dragons, and let villains be soundly killed at the end of the book. Nothing will persuade me that this causes an ordinary child any kind of degree of fear beyond what it wants and needs to feel. For, of course, it would be a little frightened. So I love what he's describing there. We need, especially, of course, his really famous line, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage if they're going to meet
Yes.
cruel enemies. And so this idea that, like, whether you like it or not, our kids are growing up in a world, there's nothing safe about this world. One of the things that we talked about in the previous discussion was that it's the people that are most safe, that are most offended by the fact that evil exists, that suffering exists. And so I think one of the things that can really steel your children against that kind of doubt in God is for them to read really challenging stories where there are some scary things that happen that need to be overcome. So yeah, Sydney, any of that stir up anything for you?
Yeah, I actually watched a video on this one time, and how it was saying, like, in defense of, like, of scary villains and kids, movies in particular, and how if you're not scared by the villain, you're not gonna feel invigorated when they get defeated. Like, you're not going to, appreciate the hero's bravery. You're not gonna feel any of that, and I think that's so true. Like, we shouldn't be trying so hard not to scare kids, because then they'll never see real bravery. So, yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, I think
I
one of
love
the
that quote.
yeah, it's so good. One of the greatest misunderstandings about parenting, I would say in the last 30 years, was that we decided to replace courage with self-esteem, and those are
Mhm.
not the same thing. Children don't need self-esteem, they need courage. And self-esteem is believing that you are just inherently always sort of the right person. Like, you should feel good about everything you're doing and everything you are, and there's nothing that you need to improve in. And just we need to pump kids full of just this idea that that who they are, that they don't need to change anything, they don't need to grow in any way. And obviously, there's a kernel of understanding that their value ultimately should not be tied to what they do, but ultimately, like, the problem with that is that if I'm already perfect, if I'm the perfect embodiment of everything that I ever need to become, then I don't need courage. And I can just be endlessly offended and
No
offend.
resilience.
Yes, there's no resilience. There's constant offense. And there's anytime you face real obstacles that require courage to overcome, you won't have it because you'll be so shocked. And that's what these stories are so good at describing. Like, when you especially read a story about a child who was forced to have courage. Man, that is so good for kids to see. Courage
Yeah.
is courage is the virtue under all other virtues, right? Every other virtue, the virtue of honesty, can only exist if you have the courage to be honest, right? Every other virtue depends on courage. And if you bleed away from a child their ability to be courageous, then you're not just bleeding away one virtue, you're bleeding away every other virtue. So, that
Mhm.
I think stories are really designed to help us get to that place and help us deal with, like, the suffering and the challenges and the evil of the world. So we need to introduce kids to them, and it's one of the most fun parts of it being a parent is getting to see your kids, go through, like, the discovery of a good story. And man, I love that we're getting to have another generation where we get to do that with. So awesome. Well, thanks, Sid, for jumping on here today. It's been great talking about these
Yeah, thank
things.
you. Yeah, this is fun.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.